My sermon today is based largely upon the novel The Tin Drum. And in this novel, Oskar Matzerath narrates his life from the setting of a mental asylum. It is clear from the start of this book that he is not living in ordinary times, nor is he an ordinary narrator. He witnesses the destruction of the Weimar Republic, the frenzy of the Nazi movement, and the birth of the Third Reich, and finally the war and commencement of post-war Germany. And this is in part why I thought this would be an appropriate sermon for today on Memorial Day weekend, as we remember the people who died in our past wars. So all of that about Oskar Matzerath sounds serious and high-minded and straightforward, but trust me, the story gets weird from there. From what Oskar tells us, he is born with the perfectly formed mental capacities of an adult, and he's unimpressed with the world from day one. His voice can shatter glass and even carve designs into its crystalline structures. And what's more is that at the age of 3, he decides to stop growing. This is not without reason, Oskar explains, for he is disgusted by the adults around him and so makes the decision to remain a toddler. Doing so affords him the advantage of remaining an observer of what he dubs a degenerate society sliding towards National Socialism without having to grow up to be a part of it. Yes, it's a strange story that only gets stranger. The personality of Oskar represents a protest against German fascism. Part of his protest, aside from refusing to grow up, is that he also refuses speech, communicating either with screams or by doing subversive things with his drum. In my favorite scene from this novel, Oskar attends a rally with his father, who is an avid Nazi Party member. Breaking away from his dad, he climbs under the band's grandstand. The band will play the marching music that will accompany the Nazi rally. Oskar writes this in his journal: "My drum was already in place. With divine suppleness, I let the sticks play in my hands, and with delicate wrists, I laid a joyful waltz rhythm of consummate artistry upon my drum, sending it forth with increasing insistence, conjuring up Vienna and the Danube, until the first and second row of drums at the Nazi rally above me found pleasure in the waltz. The other instruments begin to follow suit, abandoning the Nazi marching beats for Oskar's dance tune." He continues, "The music was now mine, and the Volk, the people, thanked me for it. Laughter broke out in front of the grandstand, and a few people were already singing along, hopping about happily. The music was in their legs. The Nazi leaders, on the other hand, are fuming about this, furious that this dance has broken out at their march and completely disrupted their plans. But," writes Oskar, "there was nothing left for them to save. The Volk danced off across the lawn, leaving it thoroughly trampled, but green and deserted." Hence, with his drum, Oskar, the perpetual 3-year-old, destroys a Nazi rally, turning it into a laughable farce. In 2009, exactly 50 years after its initial publication, a spate of articles appeared about the novel The Tin Drum. It is easily the most famous work by Günter Grass, earning him wide acclaim and eventually the Nobel Prize in Literature. With its publication, he became one of the preeminent literary voices in post-war Germany, a time when people wondered what, if anything, could be written about that horrific period. Perhaps because of the complexity of the time and the ambivalence of the way that people felt, the tin drum is expansive and complicated and hard to fit into a single genre. Michael Dida puts it this way: with magic realist brio, the tin drum mixes fantasy, gallows humor, several pathetic love stories, a tragic family saga, and a powerful account of how great political events affect, usually disastrously, a small group of ordinary people. Another critic says that the novel is not about the 20th century, it is the 20th century, capturing the full contradictions, absurdities, and difficulties of that time. Now, one of the things that sets the tin drum apart is its portrayal of the spread of fascism. Some of the author's contemporaries who were writing novels at the time portrayed Nazism as an almost cosmic force of evil. Not so for Günter Grass. Instead, the tin drum portrays it as neither mythological nor especially hypnotic. The novel exposes the ways that National Socialism appealed to ordinary Germans. For example, Oscar's father was a simple grocer of the middle class who cheerfully went to Nazi rallies. He was not coerced, nor did he show up only when it was necessary. Instead, he made a conscious choice to join the party. This was a shocking thing to portray in literature in Germany at the time, at a time when people were really trying to distance themselves from Nazism. Some even speculate that this aspect of his writing earned Grass condemnation in some German literary circles, and one award, the Bremer Award, that was going to be awarded to him was revoked at the last moment because of this particular portrayal of Nazism. And it makes sense. By portraying National Socialism in such unexceptional and everyday ways, he refused to give his participants an alibi. This may be a more sobering and even depressing view, but I also think that it's more honest and searching. It suggests that hate spreads when our communities embrace it and when we allow it to grow, not because it is some kind of cosmic force that forces us into its grasp. This week, I was walking through Deerfield with my significant other and his mom. It was a beautiful spring morning. The deep green blood of cut grass was pungent in the air, while yellow and red songbirds flitted overhead. We had gone for brunch at the Cherry Pit, and the sweet taste of French toast and coffee lingered from the experience. As we were returning on that perfect morning, we saw a house up ahead. It had 2 flags outside of it. One was an American flag, and the other was one that none of us recognized. I immediately pulled out my iPhone to look it up. As it turns out, it is a flag that is most often displayed at white supremacist rallies. This is in the middle of Deerfield. None of us knew exactly what to say to each other, so we kept walking. That otherwise beautiful morning was ruptured by something ugly and deeply troubling. Unfortunately, there's a part of me that is not really shocked by this incident because it is becoming so commonplace in our culture. While membership in the KKK has dropped significantly in recent years, overall membership in white supremacist organizations has spiked. The Anti-Defamation League reported recently that white supremacist propaganda has surged on campuses, more than tripling in the year 2017. Just last week, our president called people who cross the border animals, which is chilling language that has been used to dehumanize and harm minority groups throughout history. The largest white supremacist rally in recent decades occurred in Charlottesville in 2017. People are feeling emboldened and empowered to state racist beliefs in public settings in ways that have been absent until recently. And we also have our own dose of absurdity in the midst of all of this too, I think. Rather than having a major sports organization express concern about any of the things that I have just mentioned, this week the NFL has decided that the sight of someone kneeling during the national anthem is the thing that is unacceptable and worthy of a fine. I think that we are living in troubled times. And the question becomes, how can we find ways to make a difference? How can we find ways to have the courage to change this? The tin drum turns out to be quite ambivalent, even cynical about the prospect of resistance. While he hates the Nazis and wants to undermine them, Oscar also believes that his actions against them have little effect. He insists that he is certainly no prophet heralding the end of a regime. This is what he says after disrupting that Nazi rally with his drum. There was no Lord to greet me and say, "Arise and go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it. I had affairs of my own to attend to. I was not Jonah, so I tucked my non-biblical drum under my arm, and without hitting my head or scratching myself on a nail, emerged from the bowels of that grandstand that had the proportions of a prophet swallowing whale merely by chance. And then I walked away." He follows this up by saying, "It would never occur to me to see myself as a member of the resistance based upon 6 or 7 disrupted rallies." So why does Oscar reject his own acts of protest as meaningful? I think that a part of this is because most of the resistance in the novel comes to very little. One pivotal moment occurs when the city of Oscar's birth, which had remained independent until the war, is overtaken by Nazi Germany. As the city comes under siege by German forces, employees of the local government offices barricade their doors to prevent the takeover. Oscar and the postman Jan Bromsky find themselves in the post office as bombs and gunfire surround them. They sit in a room littered with white envelopes of undelivered mail. With no weapons left and with little hope, Oscar and Jan begin to build a house of cards. It gets taller and taller as the fighting gets nearer and nearer. Several of the men who are fighting eventually slip into Nazi uniforms and escape into the night, abandoning their posts and pretending that they are a part of the German fascist movement. But Jan and Oscar stay until the end, when finally the cards collapse and Jan is shot in the back. Oscar is mistaken for a 3-year-old and rescued. This episode shows, I think, the novel's position that even those who try to resist were completing a fool's errand. They were building a house of cards. The power of the Nazi takeover was too great for any individual to make a serious difference. Part of the pessimism around the prospect of resistance might be the author's own biography. Günter Grass was not a Nazi resistor during the war, and in fact was conscripted into Nazi service at the age of 15. He says that that is a shame he will take with him to his grave. This shame and helplessness shows up in the novel in multiple ways. Oscar, after all, ends up in a mental asylum, taking responsibility for crimes he did not directly commit, but nonetheless feels culpable for. It's a very telling moment in the novel. I can personally only imagine the horror of living through that time. And I wonder if I might become jaded and hopeless and think resistance is all just building a house of cards. But I'm going to hold on to another possibility today. I want to believe that there is a potential that we can make a difference. I can take this lead from Oscar's story itself. He asks what basis he has to claim that he is a part of any sort of resistance. After all, he's only disrupted 6 or 7 rallies with his drum. And that is true. That perspective would be true if there are no others who are insisting on making a difference as well. But what if there were others? What if there were lots of tin drummers disrupting the Nazi machine? How many would it take before rally after rally collapsed and the spread of hate was halted? We have seen this throughout history. This is not a novel, an unheard of thing. From the salt marches against British imperialism in India, to the civil rights protests against Jim Crow in Selma, to the rivers of people marching against apartheid in South Africa, none of these were accomplished by a single individual to the beat of a single drum. They were successful only because a movement of people decided it was time to make a difference. So people can make a difference. This week I was on a conference call with the minister of Countryside Church and members from both of our congregations. We're looking at ways that we can partner around the Poor People's Campaign. The objective of this campaign is to bring attention to issues such as poverty and economic inequality, systemic racism and prejudice, and ecological catastrophe. Its leader, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, says it is not created to draw attention to issues that belong to the left or the right, but rather issues that are related to our country's moral center. Barber and others are calling people to show up to its gatherings and engage in conversation and action that will bring America back from the brink of bitterness and prejudice and recall us to our grander ideals. In papers and in newscasts across the country this week, as we've greeted that other news that has been quite unsavory, we also have seen hope. You can see images of Unitarian Universalists and others being arrested across the country as they stand up for the values that they believe in. In that vein, Countryside and North Shore will have the opportunity to go to Chicago for the campaign on June 19th, and we will hopefully also have a joint potluck and worship service beforehand in order to prepare. More about this will be published in our newsletter, so I would ask you to stay tuned. Because at the end of the day, there may be no Lord who will say unto you, arise and go to Nineveh or to Washington, D.C., or to the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago next month. But I hope that you find the guts to do it anyway. After all, anybody can play a tin drum.